5, 4, 3, hands on keys, turn. Greetings and felicitations. This is Michael Haspel, and welcome to Quantum Froth Dispatches. With this episode, we continue our journey towards 1982, The Wrath of Khan, Star Trek II. Albeit we are proceeding at full impulse and not warp speed, because there's a lot to cover. When we last left off with with the previous episode, we were talking about something called Star Trek Phase 2, which was going to be another television program launched on a fourth network that Paramount was trying to launch. Now, their idea was that they were going to have, a whole new series. They had done, I believe this started in 1975. They had done a bunch of different tests, some of which you can still find on the YouTubes. And they had some pretty heavy hitters that were writing some episodes. Alan Dean Foster, DC Fontana came back, Ray Bradbury, all kinds of really heavy hitters that had come around to liking Star Trek since its cancellation in '69. Because through syndication and through the animated series and stuff, Star Trek had gotten quite a big following. And we talked about how it was very much in the forefront of the public consciousness, even with letter writing campaigns to the president to get NASA to rename the shuttle Columbia the Enterprise. So that's kind of where we're going to pick up. And If it sounds a little bit familiar that, hey, Paramount is going to use Star Trek as a cornerstone to launch a new network, that's exactly what CBS did with Star Trek Discovery. They wanted to launch their streaming program, and so they used Star Trek Discovery to push it. One of the things I can't understand why they didn't do is why they didn't push more than just Star Trek Discovery. There were very notably some really well-made fan creations that they could have used as either a web series or something like that. I'm talking about like the Star Trek Continues, of course Axanar, which was at the center of all the controversy that followed there. And I really do think that CBS lost an opportunity there because they could have won a lot of goodwill, throwing some fan-produced stuff on there with these fan-made productions are on a shoestring budget. They could have handed them some money that's chump change to CBS, but would have made those fan presentations just so much better, made everyone's life better, and then launched, a premiere Star Trek Discovery that costs, $1 million an episode or wherever. But they got Netflix to pay for it all and foot the bill, and it is what it is. They are adding some shows to the CBS lineup, and I really don't know another place to talk about this, so I will talk about it now. There is apparently a show starring Michelle Yeoh is attached to it about Bureau 13, or the covert arm of Starfleet. And then one that I'm actually pretty excited about is called Lower Decks, and they've ordered some episodes for that. It's a half-hour animated comedy about one of Starfleet's least important ships, focusing on the support crew. To me, that sounds a lot like the Orville, which, in my opinion, is the spiritual successor to Star Trek. But what makes it sound a little different is they've hired Mike McMahon as the showrunner, and that guy is the head writer, or one of the head writers, and one of the executive producers of Rick and Morty. So if you're telling me that there's going to be a Rick and Morty style animated comedy in half-hour episodes that are going to be set in the Star Trek universe, to me that sounds pretty good. For reasons of my own, I'm probably still not going to watch it, but that's because I'm not going to subscribe to CBS's thing, no matter what they do. And that's kind of I have other reasons for that I'm not going to get into right now. But to get back to our journey towards Star Trek 2, so we have Star Trek Phase 2 that is going to be a television show, and Paramount is going to launch it as their cornerstone for their network, and they decide that the network, they analyze how much money it would take to support the network through advertising dollars, and the number crunchers come back and say, yeah, you can't, it's not going to work out. You can't really do it. So they decide to kill the network, the Paramount network, but they still have this other Star Trek series that they're trying to do. And they have a 2-hour pilot that was set up. And the 2-hour pilot is called In Thy Image. It's written by Alan Dean Foster. And it actually bears a lot of structural similarities and everything to an episode called The Changeling, which was one of the originally aired episodes, involving kind of a human Earth space probe that the Enterprise winds up running into. So they decide that they're going to try to push this as kind of a backdoor pilot, which is very common, and they're going to try to sell it to one of the other 3 networks. But the other 3 networks pretty much kill it as punishment for Paramount pursuing the idea of a 4th network. So you have Star Trek Phase 2, you have this pilot, and it's kind of floundering. They really don't have anywhere to go, and it looks like the project's going to die. So they kind of really, there's no avenue for this and everything. We talked about in the last episode how there were some aspects of Star Trek Phase 2 that would see reuse in other venues. Like we had Willard Decker, who is the son of Commodore Matt Decker. He's the Commodore that's flying his ship against the Doomsday Machine in the episode of the same name, the Doomsday Machine. We also had Lieutenant Ilea, and we also had a new Vulcan science officer named Zahn. And we know that some of these character studies and traits and everything were reused as William Riker and Deanna Troi and Data in Star Trek The Next Generation. So some of these things came back. They actually even used some of the episodes that had been written for Star Trek Phase 2 in The Next Generation. But another avenue kind of presented itself, and it was since 1968, since there were rumors that would have been the 2nd season of Star Trek TOS, there had been some mutterings led by Gene Roddenberry about if the show was canceled, why not Paramount just pursue a big budget feature? And he had been talking about this since 1968, and it had been bouncing back and forth and everything, and ideas for features had, surfaced and resurfaced and been canceled, and the feature had been kind of set aside because they were like, hey, if we're, Star Trek is not a feature film property. It was the thinking at the time. So let's set the feature aside because Star Trek belongs on television. Star Trek's a television show, and so they killed the feature ideas for Star Trek Phase 2. But now, Star Trek Phase 2 kind of dying. So they start to apply pressure to the studio. There's a couple letter writing campaigns. There's a couple stuff like that. The Paramount executives, who, by the way, when I was reading these things, I was surprised at some of the names that were coming up, like Katzenberg and Eisner. These are future CEOs of Disney and of DreamWorks. So this is interesting that all these people are kind of involved this early on. It was kind of cool. But now they're starting to talk about, hey, even though we're getting rid of Phase 2, let's try to do and I apologize for that. I just had like some weird technical difficulties, so I'm just gonna continue because I think I cleared it. So in any case, they're gonna try to make a feature film using the stuff that they've already developed for Star Trek Phase 2. Now, keep in mind, there were screen tests, there were castings, they had people writing episodes already, so they've sunk some money into this. Like, and right now they're in kind of, well, if Phase 2 doesn't happen, then our costs, we've just lost all this money. So it's a way to recoup some of their funds that they already spent, and they're going to try to do that. So this is around June 1976. So the Paramount executives have been messing around with ideas for film, for a TV series, for et cetera, et cetera. They assign a guy named Jerry Eisenberg to be executive producer of the project, and they give him a whopping budget of $8 million. Now, even in 1976, $8 million is probably borderline like the minimum you would need to make a big budget Star Trek film. So it's and we'll talk about some of the box office and some of the budget problems in a little bit when we get to that. And then in addition to Eisenberg being given executive producer along with Gene Roddenberry, of course, they have this guy, John Povil, who was one of the story developers for Star Trek Phase 2. They start telling him, okay, you need to go find some writers to write a script. So it appears at this point that they're kind of just setting aside the whole In Thy Image soft pilot story by Alan Dean Foster and Gene Roddenberry. And so John Povil goes around and he starts looking for people that would be open to writing a script, to develop a script. And he had a list of, I think it was over 34 people. It was a ton. And I love that he included his own name on there. He was like, John Povil, and then he writes, he's probably going to be a big shot someday, and we should hire him now while he's cheap and humble. So I think that's awesome that he threw his own name in there. But some of these names, heavy hitters. And when I read these off, I'm only going to read off a couple, but you tell me if you wouldn't want a Star Trek story written by them. So you have Edward Anhalt, Ernest Lehman, Robert Bloch, who Robert Bloch was actually a protege of one Howard Phillips Lovecraft, and he is probably most famous for having written Psycho. James Goldman, Francis Ford Coppola. Yeah, right? And George Lucas. He was already he was already on their radar. Now this is June 76. Of course, Lucas is kind of busy, and Coppola is kind of busy. So, but they're settling these things around. These British screenwriters, Chris Bryant and Alan Scott, wind up being picked. They had done a couple of thrillers and everything like that. But the reason they got the job is when they asked him, well, how do you envision Star Trek and everything? One of them was basically Bryant told Roddenberry that he was basically like one of Horatio Nelson's captains in the South Pacific, where he's like 6 months away from home, 3 months away by communication, and he has to do all this stuff and everything like that. And I'm going to take a quick segue here, just a small one, to talk about what I think is one of the best Star Trek films ever made. But it is not a Star Trek film. But man, does it hit all the notes. And if you just kind of headcanon it, it becomes a Star Trek film real quick. And it would be excellent. In fact, if somebody remade this film as a Star Trek film, I bet you could get it past 90% of the movie-going audience, and no one would know the difference. And I'm talking about the film Master and Commander, Far Side of the World. It is, of course, not Star Trek, not science fiction remotely, but all the elements are there because Roddenberry kind of did this whole Captain Hornblower, Horatio Nelson kind of thing. And Star Trek has always treated ships like they were either two things, either submarines or ships of the line, blasting away broadsides at one another. And if you take Master and Commander and you just kind of rejigger things and split the Doctor character into Bones and Spock and have, the Russell Crowe character, the captain, be Kirk, and have, instead of a French frigate out there, it's maybe a Romulan ship or a Klingon ship, and they are competing for resources on a planet that the Galapagos stand in for, it starts to become a Star Trek story really, really quickly. and if somebody enterprising would just take that and just massage it so that it was in outer space and among the the neutral zone or something like that, I think it would absolutely work. It would absolutely work. But to jump back to this anyway, they start to figure out, hey, we need to write this script, we need to do all this stuff. And they decide that they need some directors, right? So again, they start listing this list of directors. And again, you're like, man, I would really want to see a Star Trek film directed by one of these people. So the four names that really come up out of the list of big possible directors are Francis Ford Coppola, again, George Lucas, Steven Spielberg, and Robert Wise. And these are, really heavy hitters, although, Lucas had made his mark, I think, with American Graffiti, and he was, of course, still working on Star Wars. Coppola had been around for a while, the Godfather films, the, Apocalypse Now, stuff like that. Spielberg had done Jaws, so he that's the first real blockbuster, so he's going to be on a short list for making a lot of money. And Robert Wise, we will talk about in a moment, because he's the one that actually gets the gig. But in between Robert Wise, they have a guy named Philip Kaufman, who is signed up to direct, and he has never seen an episode of Star Trek. So they decide they're going to give him a crash course. So this brings me to a useful, fun exercise. So we'll take a little segue here on that. So Gene Roddenberry is asked to put together 10 episodes for this person to screen, for this director, Philip Kaufman, to screen, to kind of get what Star Trek is all about. And at this point, when I was looking at it, I just kind of went, well, I'm going to stop right here. I'm not going to research anymore. I'm going to stop, and I'm going to make my own list of, hey, if I'm trying to convince somebody you need to make a Star Trek film, like say, hey, JJ, here's why your films aren't really Star Trek, in my opinion. Here are the episodes that you should have watched before making these, and at least had a good grasp of the character dynamics and kind of the rules of the show and how things work. So I went ahead and made a list of my 10 episodes. I cheated. I gave myself 2 honorable mentions that were like, hey, if you like the first 10, go ahead and watch these other 2. And I would encourage you to kind of make, to pause this right now and then make your own list of 10. And then we can all kind of just compare. So I'm going to read my list first, and you'll just have to take my word for it that I did not cheat and look at what Roddenberry screened for the director. These are mine, right? The City on the Edge of Forever, that's one with the Guardian of Forever. Edith Keeler, Joan Collins famously stars in that one. Also, what's really funny about that one is if you look at some of the landmarks when Kirk and Edith Keeler are walking around town, they're actually in Mayberry. There's actually some very recognizable landmarks from Mayberry, because of course they're on the back lot, at Paramount. And so they're filming there. And so they're walking by, and you can see the barber shop from Mayberry. And there's some very recognizable landmarks from there. Balance of Terror is one of my favorite episodes ever. Really kind of an old submarine destroyer World War II story, reset in space. Really good job. Mark Leonard plays Zenfrodicius, I think is his name, who is the Romulan commander of the ship, and this is the episode that introduces cloaking devices. So that's really notable. And of course, Mark Leonard also played Spock's father in Journey to Babel and subsequent appearances, and he was also the Klingon commander of the Imperial cruiser Amar, which appears in about the first 5 minutes of Star Trek The Motion Picture. So he was notable for having played like 3 of the major races of Star Trek, which is kind of cool. Number 3 on my list, and I don't have these in any particular order. I just numbered them so I could keep track of when I got to 10. Number 3 was Errand of Mercy. Has one of the best Klingon captains in there. Number 4, Space Seed. 5, The Enterprise Incident, which I absolutely adore, and the Star Trek Continues people made an incredible sequel to that. That must be seen to be believed. The Trouble with Tribbles is number 6. Mirror, Mirror, of course. Amok Time, Spectre of the Gun, Devil in the Dark. And then for my 2 kind of honorable mentions, I had A Piece of the Action and Day of the Dove. And I really do like A Piece of the Action, even though it's kind of silly. And I just like the idea of, the core idea of it is that, if you haven't seen it, that Starship crashes, basically the crew. Oh, they don't crash. I'm getting Return of the Archons mixed with this. But the crew basically stops in, accidentally violate the Prime Directive because they leave a book behind that's like called Chicago Gangs in the 1920s. And the people on the planet take it that that's like the book they should model their entire society after. And so it winds up really messing up the entire planet because they're acting like Chicago gangsters from like the 1920s and 30s when the Enterprise finds them. And the Enterprise, of course, has to intervene because the other ship already messed up the Prime Directive. So the Enterprise has to intervene, but it has all kinds of hilarious slang. It's just generally really, really funny, and all the characters kind of have a really good time with it. They play things just really over the top camp and everything like that. It's a really fun episode. But here were the episodes that Gene Roddenberry chose to screen. And there is, I'm happy to say, a lot of overlap. So the 10 episodes from Gene Roddenberry were The City on the Edge of Forever, The Devil in the Dark, Amok Time, Journey to Babel, Shore Leave, The Trouble with Tribbles, The Enemy Within, The Corbomite Maneuver, and This Side of Paradise. And last one, A Piece of the Action. So I was just like, okay, so he listed a couple of them that I didn't have. And it's also interesting to note that in both our lists, they're scattered all through all 3 seasons. So, in the last episode, we talked about how a lot of people didn't think that season 3 had a whole lot of good episodes in there, but there are some season 3 episodes in both our lists. So in any case, this guy goes off and he starts studying and everything, and he comes up with an idea. And man, I really would love to see this, but unfortunately, this is going to be one of those, man, I wish I could do this, but unfortunately, we'll never get to see this. This guy had an idea where he had an idea that was a story where Spock was the captain of his own ship, and Toshiro Mifune played Spock's Klingon nemesis. And I'm like, holy cow, that would be absolutely amazing. And Toshiro Mifune, of course, a Japanese actor famous for Yojimbo and the Seven Samurai and all kinds of other stuff. He's really a phenomenal guy. But in the meantime, so all these ideas are being bandied about. They start working on different concepts for everything. And one of the concept artists that they wind up hiring to develop stuff for this new motion picture, just concepts, planets, aliens, stuff like that, is Ralph McQuarrie. Now, those of you who are really hardcore into Star Wars will know that Ralph McQuarrie was who George Lucas hired as his production kind of art designer when he was coming up with ideas for, like, what does Chewbacca look like, what is a lightsaber and everything. If you go online and type in Ralph McQuarrie Star Wars, you will see all these iconic pictures and everything. And McQuarrie also did some famous illustrations for Spielberg, notably the picture in Raiders of the Lost Ark when they open up the big book that Indy has that may or may not be a Bible. And you see people, Israelites, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, and there's rays coming out, and the army intel guy asks, what are these supposed to be, And they're like, oh, the power of God or whatever. That he drew that piece of art as well. But he was really definitive for Star Wars and the look of Star Wars, the ones that came up with X-Wings and all that kind of thing. That he's the one who kind of, working with George Lucas, came up with that kind of thing. And he came up with a design for the new Enterprise, the refit Enterprise that was going to show up. Now, that is not the refit Enterprise we get in the film. This Enterprise, and I would encourage you to go online and type in Ralph McQuarrie USS Enterprise or Star Trek, and a couple of things will come up. And then you will notice a ship that has a dish that is very, very low to the body. And the body is triangular in nature with the nacelles almost parallel with the dish, very, very low. It's a very, very flat triangular design that looks almost exactly like the Star Trek Discovery. And I was actually really surprised to see that, because and I'll freely admit, when they first released the teaser for Star Trek Discovery and showed the ship, I was not on board. I was like, this looks like some kind of a Klingon D7 design with like a Federation saucer section slapped onto it. And that is kind of what it looks like. And when you see the Ralph McQuarrie design, I was like, wow, this design for the Enterprise has been lurking around since 1976, 1977, around there. And they're finally putting it on screen. So it's interesting. Some of the other designs wound up showing up in Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock, as background ships that were in Space Dock, and they've shown up in Star Trek The Next Generation as well. So there was some of the interiors and everything that they had designed for Star Trek Phase 2, they were going to reuse some of these sets and everything for Star Trek The Motion Picture, which it's not called that at this point. It's still kind of this nebulous out there Discovery. A lot of these sets wound up getting scrapped for Star Trek, but wound up showing up in Moonraker, of all things. So it was just kind of funny that they were there. They were, at the time McQuarrie was working on it, there really wasn't a script yet. And he was just kind of winging it, just based on what he knew about Star Trek and everything. And I guess he only worked on that for about 3 months. And then that idea for the film folded. And they started working another script. And they went back to adding, to Alan Dean Foster's story idea. In the image, they had Harold Livingston start writing it. And he wrote a pretty decent script. Gene Roddenberry wound up taking it and rewriting it over the course of a week, and it kind of just it wasn't very good. And when you read this, there's a moment of there's a lot of strife going on and I kind of feel for him, because for Gene, Star Trek's kind of what he has. I mean, he worked on a lot of different things. He was a pilot. He had been a cop. He's accomplished a lot in his life, but his his masterwork is Star Trek. And so he is beginning to turn that into kind of an industry. Well, he had, and he'd been, at this point, he's still touring around all the conventions and I think charging people $5 to watch, the blooper reel. So they, he's got a lot more invested than other people in Star Trek, because if Star Trek doesn't work for him, he's kind of done, whereas other people have other projects and stuff that they're launching, kicking off the ground. When they present the first draft of the completed script to Paramount, this is about March of 1977, they basically come back with, it's a script written by committee. And if you pay attention to how movies work and everything like that, that's one of these death knell, kiss of deaths thing. It's like if you have a film made by committee or a script written and comes off by committee, that's the studio's way, or even critics' way, of saying that it's not very good. There's no central vision. There's no central story going on. There's too much happening. And that's why I really like, hats off to, there's another segue, but hats off to Marcus and McFeely. These are the guys who wrote Civil War and Infinity War, for being able to pull off massive, massive stories and still have all these different characters and give each character their little moment and their little one-liner and everything like that. It's really an amazing feat to pull off, but it's not easy, and it's not something you can really rush. And unfortunately, rushing it is kind of what, at the time, like Paramount's trying to do. They're sinking money in it. And one of the other themes that haunts Star Trek up to this point, in any way, is that, it is a money hole. It is a vampire, and you're going to be over budget and behind schedule almost from day one. And it is kind of angry. The other thing that kind of that shows up again and again in Star Trek, and you'll hear this, and it's like they go, hey, we want the characters to have fun with it this time or whatever. And it's like, well, what have they been doing before? In this case, it was almost the opposite, where they just didn't want any fun at all. They wanted it to be very, very serious. And, hey, you need to take this seriously and everything like that. We don't want any humor. We don't want any jokes. But in my opinion, when you start hearing from behind the scenes talk and everything of folks going, well, we're allowing our characters to have fun with this time. Whenever I hear that, that's like energized defense fields. That's a warning symbol that, hey, and it works for other shows really well. Guardians of the Galaxy as a perfect example, right? Or the Orville, but for some venues, it doesn't really work. The Last Jedi, you don't need your mama jokes in the first 10 minutes of the movie, but this is about Star Trek and not Star Wars. So we'll talk about the other thing that shows up. And when you're reading these letters that go back and forth and everything, these notes from the studio's exec, is they want Star Trek, but they don't want it to be science fiction. And you'll see that come up again and again and again and again and again. And not just on the TV show or Star Trek the Motion Picture, but on Star Trek 2009, you'll hear JJ say, well, we wanted Star Trek for non-Star Trek fans or non-science fiction fans. We wanted everyone to be able to get it. Now, financially, that's brilliant. That's what you want. You want it to be like a big 4-quadrant movie and everybody watches it and enjoys it and everything like that. And you don't need it to be quote unquote science fiction. And everyone will get it and everyone will love it. And turns out JJ did that in 2009 and they made a lot of money. In fact, it was, I think, the second most financially viable or financially successful film after Star Trek Into Darkness. But the franchise is dead now. Because these like diehard fans that go to Comic-Con, that know what this button on the console does and everything like that, they'll go see your movie 6, 7, 8 times. The casual fan that doesn't want to see science fiction, that doesn't really care about Star Trek, they'll go see it once. And that's what happened. So they had a massive drop-off with Star Trek 3, pretty much bombed. And I don't mean Star Trek 3, The Search for Spock. I mean Star Trek Beyond or whatever it was called. I didn't even bother seeing it. But in any case, when you hear them say, we want Star Trek, but we don't want science fiction, we want it to be financially, that makes a lot of sense. But man, raise shields, because that's going to hurt your movie. And there are some notable exceptions within Star Trek, in fact. So, but in any case, on May 8th, Katzenberg, who is a Paramount executive at the time, informs the director that the film is canceled. So, okay, we're not going to go ahead. Film is over. It is canceled. Sorry. And note the date, May 8th, 1977. Something pretty important happens on May 25th, 1977. And those of you that are diehard Star Wars fans already know what that is. That is the opening of Star Wars. And Star Wars changes the dynamic, changes everything, right? And Star Wars is that big four-quadrant film that is science fiction but isn't science fiction. You know what I mean? That everybody can get into, kids, old people, everybody. This is the tentpole everyone is shooting for. So Paramount kind of thinks it's a fluke. Well, here's this science fiction film, which we would argue Star Wars is not science fiction, but it has the trappings of science fiction in any case. So here is exactly what Paramount was looking for. Big script, lots of actions, the visual effects, of course. But along with Star Wars, right, comes a big wrench. It's like, hey, very clearly, you are not going to get away with your 1966 visual effects, which were made on a television budget for Star Trek, you know? They did what they did on Star Trek, which if you look at what they actually did for a weekly television program, it is Herculean. It is absolutely unbelievable. And there's a quote in there, I think it might be from Matt Jeffries, and I'm not sure, where he says something along the lines of, we did it because we didn't know we couldn't. And it was one of these things that, you know, if you ask people to do this, who were in the know, they would have said that's impossible with this many effect shots and everything like that. But they pulled it off in the 60s. So already you had some higher level visual effects in the 60s with like programs like, or movies like 2001, which were pretty incredible. But now it's 1977, you have Star Wars. You know, Star Wars just hits. And you're just like, yeah, we're not going to get away with what we got away with. Everything has to be bigger, better. On top of that, you're now projecting in 70 millimeter on a huge screen. Some of the tricks that you used on TV, they're just not going to work under that kind of scrutiny. So, which is, of course, one of the reasons why when they made the HD version of Star Trek, they had to go back and redo all the visual effects because they just wouldn't stand up to an HD level of scrutiny, you know. But in any case, Paramount believes that Star Wars is a fluke. No one could have predicted it. Came out of nowhere. There's just no way you could predict a movie like Star Wars. So, but then Close Encounters of the Third Kind hits, right? Spielberg's film. And again, stunning visual effects, really, really huge, big box office blast. And that convinces Paramount that, hey, there's actually a market out here for what they called message fiction or, you know, science fiction, you know. So they decide, okay, we're going to go ahead and do this, but we're going to need a bigger budget and we're going to push for a big director. And, of course, Lucas is tied up with Star Wars. Spielberg would have been great, but he just wrapped up Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So they go back to their list, and Robert Wise comes up. Now, nowadays, unfortunately, his name is no longer a household name. You know, when we say Robert Wise, I would warrant that most people don't know who he is. And I'm just going to go through some filmography from him. He made probably about 40 movies. I may be selling him short. And I'm just going to name off some, and I guarantee you, whoever you are, you've seen at least one of his movies. So I'm going to start with The Curse of the Cat People in 1944. I'm joking. He did direct that, and we will talk about cat people when we're talking about horror in 1982, because that was one of the films that influenced a bunch of things, was Cat People. Well, this is the sequel to Cat People, to the original Cat People. It's called The Curse of the Cat People in 1944. It was one of the early films that he made, but I'm only kidding. He directed the 1963 version of The Haunting. If you've never seen this movie, it was remade. It was remade a couple years back with, I want to say, Catherine Zeta-Jones and Liam Neeson. But in my opinion, used way too much CGI. It is kind of based on The Haunting of Hill House, which of course Netflix just did a series that apparently is really, really good. I haven't seen it yet, but I also heard that the Netflix series is not based on the book of the same name, The Haunting of Hill House. The 1963 version of The Haunting is one of these, if you like horror, you have to see this movie. And what Wise does with just sounds that shouldn't be there and doors opening when they shouldn't be opening, no CGI, just actors' performances, strange camera angles, shadows. It's phenomenal. It's just really, really great. Some of the other movies he did. The Day the Earth Stood Still, right? Klaatu Barata Nikto. So, pivotal science fiction film. So this guy knows science fiction. He can do science fiction. So, granted, that's not in space, that's on Earth, but that is, if you ask people, like, what are the top 10 science fiction movies of all time, The Day the Earth Stood Still would probably be right on there. And then he did Run Silent, Run Deep, critical submarine film. And remember before I was talking about how Star Trek, the original Star Trek anyway, treated things as two things, treated ships as either ships of the line, with broadsiding at one another, or as submarines. Run Silent, Run Deep. There's one of these critical submarine movies. So he's kind of perfect. And then you've got The Sound of Music and West Side Story. Everyone's seen those. Everyone has seen those. So Robert Wise becomes attached. Now, when Robert Wise becomes attached, other stuff happens. This guy's an Academy Award director. So now the prestige gets raised all over and it starts making waves. Like, hey, we had Star Wars. Now you have Star Trek with an Academy Award winning director. And it's coming back in a big way. So they start sinking a lot of money into this. And one of the things that Robert Wise is responsible for directly is that he was able to bring Leonard Nimoy back to the franchise. If you'll recall, I'll say that Nimoy had no interest in being in Star Trek Phase 2 because they offered him kind of a bit part, and there was some sore things going on between Nimoy and the cast and Lincoln Enterprises, who owned all the licensing, all the merchandising. And these guys were not getting paid for all the merchandising because when this stuff had been negotiated back in the 60s, that really wasn't a thing, but now it's starting to become a huge thing, and especially with Star Wars on the scene. I mean, Star Wars is all about merchandising. There's the notorious deal that Fox made with Lucas where they gave him the merchandising rights basically so they didn't have to pay him the money they owed him. And it was like he used that to build Lucasfilm empire. So in any case, there's a lot of sore points there between Nimoy. Apparently Robert Wise's wife and his daughter and his son-in-law were huge Star Trek fans. And they essentially said, well, you can't have Star Trek without Spock. And he took it to heart because he was not a big Star Trek fan. But he took it to heart and he brought it back to Paramount and was like, you need to settle up with these guys and get Nimoy back on the picture. So they were able to settle with Leonard Nimoy and by association, William Shatner, and so they're back on board. And so there's all kinds of different things that happen. I encourage you to go and try to dig in more. There's among the visual effects headaches that go along because they wound up hiring one firm that were kind of pains in the butt, and they started having huge cost overruns trying to do the visual effects that were required to meet kind of the standard that has now become new because of Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Star Wars. So there's a whole, I could do a whole series of podcasts behind the travails that happen behind the visual effects shooting of Star Trek the Motion Picture. The script has numerous problems. It is constantly being rewritten between Harold Livingston and Gene Roddenberry. So often, in fact, that there are so many rewrites on the script that that they have to now. Normally, you date the screen changes so people know which one they're using as the latest one. They had so many script changes on Star Trek the Motion Picture that they had to hourly. They had to timestamp them hourly so they'd know which one was the latest one. And the cast was told not even to memorize the last third of the script because things were so fluid and so changing. So they start rolling cameras without a finished script. That's a red alert. As soon as you start hearing a movie is filming without a finished script, that's kind of, this is a car wreck. Like, this is probably not going to turn out great. But looking at it from a front office Paramount point of view, they are hemorrhaging money. They have got to get something going, right? And it's like, hey, if you have the first 2/3 of the script finished and locked or close to locked, go. Like, start filming that stuff because you've got all the cast, you've got the crew, you've got visual effects, you've got all this stuff. And now they have locked in a release date ahead of the film being completed. And so they have these kind of, it's not pay to play, I don't remember the term, but it's kind of a deal with the movie theater that, hey, no matter what, if you have one of our movies to screen or not, we're reserving your theater. Now, also keep in mind, this is 1977. These are not big multiplexes. These are not like the movie theaters we have today where there's 16 theaters and you're reserving one screen. This is a one-screen movie theater and maybe two, So if you're reserving one of their screens, that means they can't show anything else. That's literally, they could go under. I mean, these guys run on a very, very low margin even today. So Paramount has this deal with them that says, hey, if we promise you that on December 7th, we are going to give you this movie and you're going to screen it and that's it. And if we don't have a movie for you to screen, we're still going to pay you. So the pressure is absolutely on, and they wind up firing the visual effects company because they're not able to turn in as many shots as they need to in the given amount of time. And they wind up hiring this visual effects master. I mean, he's a legend in the visual effects world. His name is Douglas Trumbull. He had just come off Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And he had done 2001. So he's been in the business a while, knows what he's doing. But he has as many visual effects shots as Close Encounters and Star Wars combined for Star Trek the Motion Picture. And he's got to do it in 6 months. So the pressure is on. And then, of course, there's all kinds of different things. I want to take a quick segue to talk about the Enterprise Constitution refit. This is my favorite of the Enterprise designs. It's the one that shows up in Star Trek the Motion Picture and the one in the Star Trek trilogy. It shows up in Star Trek 2, basically all the original cast films, so all the way through 6. And it is, I just adore the way the ship looks. It's a little bit more militaristic. They add things like a definite torpedo bay instead of photon torpedoes just kind of coming from wherever, some nebulous part in the saucer section. The nacelles don't no longer have the rounded look with the kind of kaleidoscope fronts. They have more of like a grilled. It looks a little bit sleeker, a little bit cooler. Instead of having kind of a radar dish in the front like the TV show did, it still has a deflector dish, but it is kind of backlit. It just looks a lot cooler. And that is honestly my favorite design out of all the designs, including the Next Generation, including, JJ's films. JJ's films come close. I don't like the nacelle design. And I'm nitpicking here. It's like literally just nitpicks. But that design, that was done by Matt Jeffries, and it was redesigned for Star Trek Phase 2, the TV show. And Richard Taylor, who was the art director, wound up kind of constructing and overseeing the construction of the model. It was about 8 feet long, 1/120th scale, which is really huge. And it took them 14 months to build. And they used this awesome white pearlized paint job that was kind of hard to photograph. And one of the interesting things is when you go to see the Enterprise at the Smithsonian or something like that, what surprised me was I always assumed that the Enterprise was white. And part of that influence was because of Star Trek the Motion Picture and The Wrath of Khan and subsequent films. The Enterprise is white. It is not white. It is actually gray. So it is just kind of funny, but the Enterprise in Star Trek the Motion Picture was actually white. And it used this kind of pearlescent paint scheme, had tiles all over it. Instead of having a very smooth surface like the original TOS did, this had little tiles and hatches and everything, influenced by the NASA shuttle program. They had a lot of advisors come in for technical consulting from NASA, MIT, the Smithsonian, JPL, to come in and add some like actual science to some of the things that were being said. Now, one of the things that's said in the movie that's kind of insane, and I think they changed it on like the director's cut and everything. When they first pick up V'ger coming towards Earth, one of these guys on the station, the commander of the station, who incidentally is the actor that was going to play Zahn. He's like in a little cameo. They gave him a little cameo in there to kind of ease that he didn't get that part. But he says something like it's 82 AUs in diameter. Now, an AU is an astronomical unit, and that is the distance from planet Earth to the sun. That is huge. If it's 82 AUs in diameter, that is, and I think it was changed in the director's cut. I think they wind up saying it's 2 AUs in diameter. Because 82 AUs in diameter is absolutely massive. Like, the Enterprise could be traveling through V'ger at full impulse for a while without getting to the other side. So, it's just something that struck me as funny. Another thing that I want to highlight, because we don't think about it nowadays. When you see like in the motion picture, there's when the V'ger sends a probe in there that attacks the lieutenant, it attacks Chekhov. And Chekhov's arm, like it strikes his arm and it starts to smoke and everything. They didn't have the CG, they didn't have the pyrotechnic stuff that we have today. They literally like applied like an acid solution to Walter Koenig's arm. And of course he was wearing a protective foil underneath and everything, but it's actually smoking. Like it's a chemical reaction that's creating that. Every single monitor on the Enterprise that you see, you can't use like a television monitor because TV and video monitors work at about 30 frames per second. Film cameras work at 24 frames a second. So you either have to get a monitor where you can change the refresh rate to 24 hertz, I guess, 24 frames a second and match it to the camera, or you start getting these kind of lines that streak up. And you can see that in some of these old movies whenever people like look at a television, an old school TV, a CRT TV, you'll see these lines going up and past the screen. And that's what you're seeing, is that the CRT is refreshing at a different rate than the camera is filming. So to avoid that on Star Trek, every single monitor that you saw on the bridge was actually a rear projected piece of film with a looped piece of film that's being projected onto something to act as the monitor. They had over 200 different pieces of monitor footage just to make the bridge look like the bridge. So you're just like, wow, that's pretty crazy. So I'm not going to do a blow by blow of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that you do see it. It's not a terrible film, is what I should say. It is not a great film, and it pains me to say that. And one of the reasons it is not a great film is, one, they wanted everything to be too serious. Two, even though it is not based on a previous episode, it shares so many similarities with a previous episode that if you've seen The Changeling, you kind of know what's going to happen. And this is the third, and I'll let DeForest Kelley kind of describe it. I was worried that when I saw the script, because the characterizations were not there, and the relationships were not there. I was disturbed, and so were Bill and Leonard. We had to put up a great fight. I think anyone will tell you that if the actors hadn't fought like hell to reestablish those relationships, they never would have been there. We would have had a special effects war. So there was a great deal of difficulty with the script, which was finally resolved to a certain extent. I still don't think there's enough of the interpersonal relationships in there, and I regret that some of them were lost. But Paramount didn't believe that the characters were as important to the public as they really were, and we couldn't tell them. There was a scene where Spock, McCoy, and Kirk meet to discuss Spock's strange behavior. To me, that was the closest thing to a real Star Trek confrontation that there was in the picture. Here the three of us came together. Spock comes in to talk about his problems and what's happening to him, and I have the line, "Well, you're lucky we just happen to be going your way." The three of us were actually very natural. That's where we should be and what we should be doing. And that goes back to kind of the Star Trek Trinity, the Star Trek Triangle, the Star Trek Triumvirate that I was hinting at in some of these other episodes between Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. And we will break that down when we talk about the Wrath of Khan. We'll do a deep dive on that, because if you can't get that dynamic right, you don't have Star Trek. Or at least I would say you don't have Star Trek, the original series, with the original crew and cast. Especially if you start undermining that triangle by throwing in additional characters, and of which some of the other movies were very guilty of doing by adding new characters, notably in Star Trek VI, etc., that kind of mess up that dynamic a little bit. In any case, the visual effects get done. They barely get done. I think they're delivered maybe 3 or 4 days before the premiere in Washington, D.C. When you read a lot of the stuff, they say that the print was delivered wet, which means that it was still drying from the developing lab, which is, I'm sure, is an exaggeration, but that's kind of the atmosphere. Like, and Robert Wise says that he wasn't really happy with the version that they showed that got the theatrical release in '79. That they were just like, hey, this is a rough cut of the movie I wanted to show. And this other phenomenon happens, right? And we've seen it happen again and again and again. And I hate to say it, but I was part of this one. And so it's like Star Trek, the motion picture comes out, and everyone agrees it is one of the best movies ever made. Now, if you go back and you read the critics, they describe that it is a slow motion picture, which is why I titled the episode the way it is. That it is not a very good movie, that it plods along, that even though the visual effects are good, they're not, they take too long, they're too slow. Everything is just ponderous, which is really terrible, because when the film begins with the Klingon attack of V'ger, it is actually really action-packed and phenomenal. It's really, really good. And then it just plods along. It's just very, very slow. And it feels like you become very aware of how long you are watching this movie. It is not like Infinity War or some of these other movies, modern day films, where you're watching it and you go, wow, that was almost 3 hours. I didn't even notice, This is, you're very conscious of, man, this thing is just not ending, is it? But when it came out, Star Trek fans were 100% convinced. This is as good as Star Wars. This is a phenomenal film. It's really, really good. It's really awesome. And the sad thing is they were all apologists. And we've seen it happen again and again with, say, The Phantom Menace or The Force Awakening, You can't say a negative word about these movies when they come out. You can't say, The Phantom Menace is really not a good movie. It's really bad. It has maybe 5 to 10 minutes of decent Star Wars action and storytelling to it out of the entire film. That doesn't make a good movie. Now, technologically, it's awesome. It's amazing, and it paved the way for a lot of other things like The Lord of the Rings. But in and of itself, it is not a good film. And the same goes for The Force Awakening. When that came out, if you were one of the people that spoke against it, wow, what's wrong with you? Can't you have fun? Et cetera, et cetera. All these things were being thrown. Because people want that, they are defending the movie they wanted to see, not the movie that was. And unfortunately, Star Trek The Motion Picture is one of those films. It's a movie you really want to adore, especially if you haven't gotten Star Trek in a decade. Any new Trek, And here it is on the big screen, and there's the Enterprise, and it looks better than she has ever looked, and the crew is back together, and you're on an adventure again with the biggest budget Star Trek has ever had. And people really, really, really wanted to like it. And unfortunately, it's just not that movie. And then add this, right? So we're going to go over some financials real quick. So the budget for Star Wars, right? Now, actually, I'll start with Close Encounters because these are there's 3 movies kind of competing that are being marked against one another, even though the motion picture comes out way later, a couple years later than these two. But Close Encounters of the Third Kind has a budget of $20 million. These are 1970 late 70s dollars, 77 through 79. So Close Encounters has a budget of $20 million, and it brings back a global worldwide box office of $340 million. That's pretty good. That's an excellent return on your investment, and pretty darn good movie, right? So everyone agrees Close Encounters, one of Spielberg's great films. Star Wars. Director George Lucas, budget $11 million. Can you believe that? I mean, even in 1975 through 77, making Star Wars for $11 million, that's, wow, man. That is a feat, right? Worldwide, take $775 million in 1977 money. That's insane. That is frankly insane. That is a return like you couldn't even imagine or believe or anything. There's no way to predict something like that. You can't target that. You can't try to recreate it. And when you do, I think you're probably setting yourself up for disappointment. But those are blockbuster numbers by today's standards. $775 million. You get a movie that makes that nowadays, that's considered a blockbuster. And, those are $1977. So Star Trek the Motion Picture starts with a budget of $8 million, remember? Balloons to $46 million. Now, consider that's 4 times more than Star Wars, right? Twice as much as Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Global box office take, $139 million worldwide. Yeah, that's not good. That is not good. It's not a bomb. It's enough that Paramount goes, you know what? There's an audience for this, and we're going to make a sequel. But the sequel is going to have to be on a television schedule and on a television budget. And they blame one person for the plodding, slow nature of the script and that it was too cerebral. And they sit that squarely on Gene Roddenberry. And Gene is out of the picture. He is no longer going to be involved with Star Trek for some time after this. So with that, we're going to go ahead and sign off, and we'll come back next time. We will talk about Star Trek, The Undiscovered Country. And, wait, did I mean The Undiscovered Country and not The Wrath of Khan? Yes, I did. And all this and more will be revealed in the next episode of Quantum Froth Dispatches. This is Mike, out. You have been listening to Quantum Froth Dispatches by Michael Haspel. Music and other cues are provided by The Fat Rat. The song you're hearing is Monody, featuring Laura Brem. If you would like to support the podcast, please visit www.patreon.com/QFD. Thank you for listening, and we now return you to your mundane reality.